Thanks very much, Matthew, but I'm just slightly concerned you've given my talk in a summary much better than I'm going to give in 25 minutes. But I'm particularly pleased to be here because I was thinking about, although I've been a fellow of the RSA for many years, it seems to me it's got a new dynamism and a new life under Matthew, lots of innovative things going on, and which was why I was pleased when I was invited to write the pamphlet. So what I'd like to do tonight is to spend most of the time actually with talking about evidence as to why, try to convince you why networks are important and why a behavioral model, a behavioral view which people, copying, imitating people on your social networks is a very strong factor, and it's an increasingly important factor as the world becomes more and more connected. But first of all, to clear some ground, okay, here is a brief summary of economic and social policy since 1945. It's had some successes, but it's essentially based on the view that people make rational decisions, whether they're individuals, whether they're firms, or whether they're planners. And because I'm an economist, and in economics we call all these decision makers agents, that's the word I'm going to use. It's just a jargon word for shorthand. So I could be talking about individuals, I could be talking about companies, I could be talking about regulators, I could be talking about governments, but I'm going to use a shorthand and say this is agents. But a policy for the last 60 years has essentially been the idea that people will react rationally when you change their incentive set. So people respond rationally when you change incentives, and incentives in turn are mainly based upon price. Not exclusively, but mainly based upon price. Let's give some examples. So if you increase benefits, for example, then you'd expect that people will tend to stay unemployed a bit longer. They'll take a bit longer to find a job. And there's some evidence this is true. If we want to alter energy consumption, if we want to tackle climate change, then we will raise taxes, make energy more expensive. And again, there's some evidence that this is true. I'll come back to this right at the end. If, like Ireland, you want to incentivize firms to invest in your country, then you'll have a low rate of corporation tax. And to some extent, that's true. If you're the Bank of England and want to control inflation, you might try altering interest rates and try and persuade people on the basis of that to spend a bit more or save a bit less or whatever your particular aim is. So you're trying to actually alter incentives through prices and hoping that people respond rationally. It's a very mechanistic view of the world that individuals, agents are operating autonomously, they're looking at the incentives, and they're actually making decisions rationally on that basis. Now, it's not without some success, but it's limited in what we can actually achieve. We've had this model for 60 years. It's had some success, but I believe we're now at the limits of this model. And it seems to me that the government recognizes this. Just a brief word, first of all, now on the concept of nudge. Very popular. David Cameron set up a unit in number 10. There's two distinguished American economists, behavioral economists, Thaler and Sunstein, and Richard Taylor comes over quite frequently to advise Downing Street and say, let's actually think about nudge rather than incentives. But in fact, to summarize it, nudge is essentially a smarter and broader way of thinking about incentives. It's actually broadening out the things that you might be able to do to nudge people into altering their behavior. Because if you think about it, the classical model, the standard model of actually altering prices, altering taxes, or whatever, is nudging people. It's saying we're making petrol more expensive. Buy less. That's a nudge for people. And they're saying, well, there might be more, that's one thing we can use. There may be more intelligent, smarter things we can sit down and think about and nudge people into different types of behavior, more acceptable forms of behavior. And this is a big step forward. It's actually potentially increasing the armory of governments away from that one single club policy of simply operating on prices through taxation or whatever. But it's still based on the idea, I put it in inverted commas here, of agents, of decision makers, deciding individually, looking at the evidence and seeing, well, how has my incentive set changed? And thinking, oh yes, I'll do this now rather than that. And that's still the essential mechanistic, economistic view of how things operate, how people respond. And so there's a certain validity in that. But networks instead, in contrast, are saying that agents can be influenced directly by what other people do. I mean, it might be part of the story, but under networks, we simply do things because other people are doing them, not through any necessarily rational evaluation of the range of incentives available to us. We see what people are doing, whose opinions we trust or whose behavior we'd like to emulate, and we often simply copy that behavior. It's a different way of thinking about the world. That decisions can be made which have little or nothing to do with the assessment of costs and benefits to the individual agent. They're solely on the basis of what others do. Now, this may seem very implausible. You know, you're all highly intelligent people. You think, no, I just simply don't behave like that. I do a proper evaluation of things before I make decisions. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about this. There's a wide variety of behavioral motives for this sort of behavior, but again, for shorthand description, I'm going to call this copying. So there might be a whole range of reasons why people imitate people on their social networks, adopt their behavior. And I'll give some examples, but I'm just going to call it copying just for shorthand. So why should people copy? Well, there's some classic experiments in psychology. Some of you may be aware of this, going back nearly 60 years, Ash's experiments in the early 50s on conformity. He gathered a group of people in a room. In the first set of experiments, people are not allowed to converse with each other. And there are simply two lines he's drawn on the board, A and B. And B is actually longer than A. Not much in it, but if you sit down, you can see B is longer than A. You say fill a form in without discussion, which is longer. And of course, almost everybody said, I mean, you might make a mistake filling the form in, but you say B. And then he gathers another group of people, but he has plants in the audience. And they say, no, A's longer. And there's a long debate about this. And incredibly, even though, objectively, we can see the evidence on the board in front of us. It's not secret, it's there, we can see. Incredibly, many people decide that A is longer as a result of people arguing in these groups that A is in fact longer, when in fact that's completely not true. It's not a question of opinion, it's simply wrong to say that A is longer, and it's demonstrably the case. But nevertheless, in Ash's experiments, he did some other ones as well, the conformity motive was very, very strong. And so we think, well, why should this be? So the behavior of an agent does tend over time to become more similar to that of the group of which there might be many groups. We're all, each of us as individuals, we identify with a whole range of different groups. But when we're operating in that mode within any particular group, we tend to become more similar in our behavior and our attitudes to the group of which we are members. So why should this be? I mean, it could be because we believe the group's got better information than we do. So if I'm sat there, I've got it, and everybody else is saying, no, line A is longer than B, and I think, I've got to be very confident and say, no, it's B. If I'm a very confident person, I'll assert that B still is longer. But I might be persuaded that in some way, and people clearly were, that line A is longer, they have better information. Or I may simply, want a quiet life, want to conform to group norms. So these are well-established experiments as to why people simply copy and imitate other people's behavior. There may be other reasons, other behavioral motives why this sort of phenomenon is very widespread. So peer acceptance, which is sort of slightly different from conformity, is a sort of signal that it's okay. People like us, can be obese, or no, we can't be, but you know what I mean. The social groups which are obese or binge drink, that it's acceptable behaviour. That, heavy drinking amongst young men has been there since time immemorial. But we now see an entirely new phenomenon where it's absolutely widespread and people collapsing in the gutters in town centres. We're all familiar with this. And it never used to be like that because people who behave like that regularly tended to be socially ostracised. It's okay to do it occasionally, especially if you remember the Bollington Club or whatever, but it wasn't acceptable behaviour. But it's suddenly become more acceptable, peer acceptance as a sort of behaviour. And I'm not saying it's a slightly subtle difference concept. It's not saying that I see people who are fat, so I decide to get fat, I conform. It's just that, say, I'm using American terminology here because they're the most obese people in the world, that if I weigh 250 pounds, well, yes, I'm obese, but if all my friends are 300 pounds, and you can translate this into kilos or, or stones, or whatever your preference is, you feel slim, even though you're actually, pretty substantial. It's okay to be. You feel more at ease. And there's several, there's a famous one, many of you will know about Connected by Fowler and Christakis, and there's the academic reference about how the probability using a very sophisticated database, which had happened to be there by serendipity, analysing people's behaviour over a long period of time, they were able to show the probability of an individual becoming obese over a period of time was strongly influenced by if their friends also became obese over this period. Last year I published a study on binge drinking in the UK to show that we could account for this, if you like, as a fashion phenomenon, that it suddenly became acceptable to actually behave in this way. But let me quote now we say we're all, we still think, well, we're intelligent people, why should we copy? But I think values are a key element in this phenomenon. I'll come back to that. But let me now talk about an experiment which is famous in some limited circles, a very powerful experiment, the so-called music download experiment, an example of copying. And this was done by, it's published in Science, which is one of the two leading journals in the world for all natural scientists, very keen to publish in Science and Nature. And here's an article in Science, so it's a properly validated article. In fact, Duncan Watts was and these do exist, a mathematical sociologist at Columbia, who since, partly as a result of this article, has been poached by Yahoo at some enormous salary. So innovation does have its rewards. It's a very innovative article. And what they did, they got a group of Columbia students, so we're talking about the intellectual elite here, and they were allowed to come in and download previously unknown songs. And this was either with or without the knowledge of previous participants' choices. So you can come in the first way, without any knowledge, you come in, you listen to, there's 48 songs in the experiment, you can listen to how many of you want, and then you can choose to download them. And this was taken from a genre, I can't remember what it was. It certainly wasn't the Beatles, but it was a genre at the time that Columbia students appreciated. So it was a sort of music they liked. And so they were allowed to take these away for free as a result of the experiments. You come in, you listen to them, you download them, you take them away. Then the other way, what he did, the only change he made, you come in as an individual, you listen to them, and then on the website, on the site from which you download it, is published the rankings of the songs, how many previous downloads there have been. So you'd see song number 35 is number 1, song number 22 is number 2, and how many there have been, it's set out for you. So we could either come in and have no information of what people have done, people's previous choices, or we could have complete information. And he did an in-between as well, where you could have the information about how many downloads had been, but in fact, it was ranked songs 1 to 48, and you had to see, you had to search out which was the most popular. So there are a number of varieties of this. He also subsequently did experiments where he changed the rules halfway through, or introduced false information. But this is a basic experiment. You either know or don't know what people have previously done. So the results are really quite dramatic. He played the experiments many times. And he took as a hypothesis that the popularity of downloads when people had no information about other people's choices was a good indicator of what people thought of the quality of the songs. Now, if you're just downloading them completely independently, that's a good indicator. But when he actually introduced this one piece of information about how many people had previously downloaded it, it turned out that success, the most popular downloads, were only determined very weakly by this objective quality of the songs. The best songs, according to independent tastes, rarely did poorly, and the worst rarely did well, but any other result was possible. Any other result was possible in these experiments. Outcomes are only weakly determined by the intrinsic quality of the product. Now, just to convince you, I'm going to now show two charts which measure in typical examples of these experiments the outcomes. So here's the number of downloads. And I'm not sure, can I ask if it's being filmed, can I move away and point, can I move away from this microphone?
Yes.
Okay, well, so here, and we've got here's the 48 songs, when people have no knowledge of what you're just downloading independently. Now this one, whatever it was, clearly wasn't very popular. There's something wrong with it, I don't know, mate. But, and what I've done here is to take 100 as the average, so I can compare the two sets of results. Okay. So by and large, the least popular got about 50, and the most popular get about 150. And these, if you like, are the independent views. So the ratio of the most popular to the least popular is about 1 to 1. And we give people one piece of information, the popularity of previous results, and we get this. Right. We get like 400 to 10. And this is a dramatic difference, just that one piece of information. This is entirely typical. And this is just one example of one experiment. They're all very similar, the results. This is not the same as the number one in the previous one. In fact, it never was. It never was. So if you were at this end of the chart on the previous one, you've a better chance of being here than if you were over there, but it's only a very weak chance. The key determinant is what other people chose. Now think about, your everyday behavior. Think about how you interface with the internet. I mean, how many people have you, when you're searching sites and it says, the most viewed story, even if you're looking at, say, the Independent website or the Guardian website, and it says most viewed story, you might click it. And you're connected on a network to people you'll never meet. It's a random selection of people who've clicked that in the past, and you click it simply because it's the most viewed story. You might be looking for something else. So our behavior is altered really quite dramatically by other people's choices. I mean, this may seem a relatively trivial example, but just reflects in general about how we use modern communications and how the information contained there influences our behavior. So those of you looking around, some of you may use it, others like me may be less familiar, but take a site like Flickr, and say, what's the most popular photograph today? And if you actually find out what this is at the end of the day, I mean, it's usually something like a dog with a stupid hat on, and it's got like 10 million downloads, or million, it's got a lot of downloads, because it happened to get, it's no intrinsic artistic merit, it's not the Mona Lisa we're looking at, and yet it's still selected because he got an early lead through some random process, and people then copied what other people had done. And so this behavior is becoming more and more widespread, simply copying and imitation. I've given some broader examples, and this is a very interesting experiment. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just simply putting these up to say there's academic work. Here's some examples of areas which have been examined and where copying, I'm using that again as a shorthand to conceal a variety of behavioral motives, where people imitate others' behavior, popular culture, adoption of innovations, diffusion of criminal behavior, socio-political behaviors, online markets, trading in financial markets. Doesn't that sound familiar? If it's a financial crisis, everything's going along, then suddenly a few people start to queue outside Northern Rock. And nothing's really changed, except you learn that there's people are trying to withdraw their money, and you're down there sharp as quickly as you possibly can be, even though you've been previously quite happy to leave your money there. Because you can see everybody else is pulling it out. Rise and fall of fads and fashions. sentiment in the business cycle. And interestingly, Haldane is an executive director of the Bank of England. He's got a very dedicated, highly mathematical team at the bank looking at spread of bankruptcy across financial institutions. It's a network in which copying implicitly takes place. So there's a whole range where copying actually is becoming more and more important. So what are the more general implications here? Here's an example of, say, worklessness, a big problem which Duncan Smith is trying to deal with. Now, of course, yes, benefits have a role. It may be that if we reduce benefits or put caps on benefits, it will have some impact. And there's evidence to suggest that that's true. Now, whether you approve of the policy or not, that doesn't matter. He's carrying the policy out, and that will have some impact. But it's not going to solve the problems. In my hometown in Rochdale, there's a notorious estate where 84% of people are on some form of benefit. I know where it is. It's not far away from where my father lives. Now, that's a question of values. So for these people, in fact, there's a marvellous piece a few weeks ago where there's at least one entrepreneurial people on the estate or nearby. He does a full English breakfast for £4.50, including a can of Stella. So, so maybe there's some hope for the area yet. But this only grows up because it's self-reinforcing. It becomes acceptable to be on benefits and drink Stella for breakfast. Whereas in other parts of the same town, even though it's a poor town with high unemployment, most people are in work with very similar socio-economic backgrounds. And yet on this estate, it's highly concentrated, and it's a culture of worklessness that's grown up as a question of social values, of imitation and copying what's acceptable in this particular locality. Yet another one is executive pay. Can we restrict this? Can we bring in limits to bankers on bonuses and so forth? Well, yes, but again, there's a culture grown up amongst executives, not just bankers, that it's somehow acceptable. I mean, some of you may remember when British Gas was privatised in the late 80s. There's an unfortunate man called Cedric Brown, who was absolutely crucified by the press for daring to pay himself £400,000 a year. Now that's just chicken feed for these people today. Somehow it's become acceptable to earn not 20 or 30 times the average wage, but 300. And it's a question of values. It's simply something that's emerged amongst the executive class, that this is acceptable behaviour. And now the big one, the environment. Now, if people believe that serious changes, and certainly the British government seems to believe this, are going to have massive changes in our energy consumption and carbon consumption over 20 or 30 years, I mean, it's simply not possible for a democratic government to bring in the tax increases which should actually incentivize people in the classic way. We're talking about massive increases in energy prices. And the only way we can achieve this, I've not got a formula for it, is by persuading people to have different values, to adopt different lifestyles, so that it becomes, say, unacceptable to go to the Caribbean, say, for a winter holiday or whatever. It needs a complete value shift if you want to make major changes. Taxes have got some role to play, maybe nudge has got some role to play, but the changes that the government want to bring about are so dramatic, they can only be done by changing values and changing the concept of what constitutes acceptable behaviour. Now, successful policy making is very difficult. We can see we've had 60 years of the welfare state, of high state spending. I'm not criticising that. I'm not going into that debate now. And it's had some successes. But clearly social problems persist, and in many ways are worse than they've been for some considerable time. It's very hard to get things right. And when you look back at that seemingly trivial example of the music download experiment, you can see why. That if copying is important, it's very hard to predict what's going to work. It's very hard, and most things, the book I wrote, most things fail. Most things are in that long tail. Most things don't take off. Even though they may be intrinsically good, have high intrinsic quality, they just don't get off the ground. So a key reason for many policy failures, I'll bring this to an end now, is a failure to recognize that networks and values which are sustained on people's real-life social networks are a key driving factor in many people's decisions. This is the way the world is. It's very difficult to get things right. But my final point is to say the first step to better policy making seems to me to be better understanding of how people make decisions and to recognize that networks is a crucial factor. And as we move through into the 21st century more and more, it's going to become even more important in the way people behave. And if we want to have successful policy, whether it's economic or social, we just have to recognize that networks and values are absolutely central to the delivery of such policies. Thanks.
Great, Paul, that's fantastic. I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then we'll open up, and we've got until about 7:30. So, Paul, you kind of, you very politely stopped at the end of your apportioned time because you're only really halfway through the story. Because it seems to me that the other half of the story, or put this one out, the danger in you having given half the story, not the other half of the story, is that we can manage networks, that they are, because the amount of incentives is they're linear. You know, if I give you, crudely, if I give you £1 to do something, you're twice as likely to do it if I give you 50p to do it, or whatever. But networks aren't like that, are they? They don't have those linear properties. They are much more random in their nature, which is why it is so challenging for policymakers.
But I mean, that's absolutely right. And I think I should have brought it out more clear, so with the music download experiment, that it's very hard for people to predict what's going to be successful. In the same way, can we predict, say, on YouTube in advance, what's going to be the most downloaded one today? No, we can't. In marketing in general, viral marketing, even people who've run fantastic and successful viral marketing campaigns find them very hard to replicate, precisely because there is this essentially random element to it, that I might be influenced by you and a few other people, but I don't have to be. There's a sort of inherent probabilistic element in people's behavior, which policymakers find this is, it's a great intellectual challenge for policymakers to recognize this, that people are not completely rational. There's an awful lot of randomness in individuals' behavior. It's a completely different view of the world, but I think it's a much more powerful one in what it explains.
So what do we understand then about what stops now? Because obviously, I remember someone pointing out in a letter to the Radio Times a very, very long time ago that if it was true that vampires had to bite somebody every night to stay alive, that within 28 days, I think the entire world's population would be vampires. So, you know...
But you could bite the same person.
Oh, no, you can't.
All right.
Because you can't bite other vampires. I think that's right, isn't it? Anyway, but the young people.
Yeah, all right, yes, yeah.
So the one problem with this kind of network is, well, if these networks work, then, if we're all being virtuous with each other and we all go out on the streets, more people will be, within 28 days, the entire world will be living a life of total virtue. So why is it...
One way it doesn't do that, well, I mean, evil may be more attractive, and there are people setting other examples, but... because people are not, it doesn't mean that people will be persuaded. And if you set an example, it doesn't mean people automatically follow you. They'll form a view on what other people are doing. And people differ in their willingness to be persuaded. That some people will copy almost anything. And so, Matthew's behaving well, I'll try that. Other people may take a lot of persuasion, especially, and I think in particular, the more we come to people's core values as they perceive themselves as individuals, important things, people may take a lot of persuasion. So the persuadability. And when we set up, mathematical models of this, we can show that's a key factor in actually stopping what we could call the cascade of behavior, keeping it very limited. And the way to succeed is to identify pockets where people are highly persuadable individuals. Now that's a very, very challenging task for policymakers. On that estate in Rochdale, there must be some people on it who really do want to live a different lifestyle. How do we find out how they are? How do we go in and persuade these people to set a different example? The ones who are easily persuaded. It's a very difficult challenge. And it's not something we can do, from the town hall or Whitehall by changing incentives. It requires really deep knowledge and getting inside in a practical way in that environment and find out who might be persuadable.
Two last questions and we open up. The other thing is that networks have got different shapes and properties, haven't they? So I was reading a piece in the LRB, I think the other day, it might be the New York Review, about Mexican drug gangs. And it just said in passing, one of these things that we know about drug gangs, which is the problem with drug gangs is if you kill the leader, you just get a new leader. So we have some models of networks, which is you start with this person and then it grows through concentric circles. And in that model of network, if you could find the kind of the person spreading the virus, as it were, and take them out, then the network would diffuse. Other networks, like a gang, that tends not to be the case. If you take the top guy out, you just get a new top guy. It might be worse than the previous top guy.
No, I think that's a very important point. And I mean, people might not be aware of it, but there's, in the last 10 years, there's been a massive amount of work done, both theoretical and empirical, on different types of structure of networks. Mainly not by social scientists, mainly by physicists and mathematicians who are starting to look at social issues. So we know a lot more than we did 10 years ago. And there are ways of, and the different structures, if you like, do make a big difference as to the sort of interventions that might matter. If it is the case, there are a few top people who influence very large numbers of people, then identifying these may be difficult. In the drug gang leader, you might not be able to find him, or you might not know who he is. He's taking elaborate precautions. But that's right. But if there are different, like, friends of friends networks, overlapping...
Some networks are hierarchical.
Yeah, and some of overlapping friends of friends, and they're much more difficult to penetrate. And unfortunately, the case studies are increasingly showing that in many social issues, that's a much more pervasive type of network, things that approximate that, than the ones where there are a few key individuals who influence large numbers. And actually, how we actually handle these is still very much an open issue.
So do you think ultimately, I mean, when social science was created, the positivists, they kind of felt in the end you would be able to apply the same kind of concepts in the natural sciences that you could apply to social. I'm sure our view of natural science has changed since then, but do you think that networks is an issue which is complicated or complex in the sense that, do you think it's something which eventually we can really understand these things and really make a difference to them, or are they so inherently kind of unstable, and there's so many different factors at play that we'll never really understand how network effects work?
Well, I suppose the only honest answer is to say it's the latter, that we'll never get complete understanding. But even a partial understanding can take us a very long way. I mean, if we pretend we're living in a world of this linear, mechanistic world, where all we need to do is incentivize people, even in a clever way through nudge, that's got fundamental limitations. That's almost played out as a sort of policy paradigm. We've done as much as we possibly can. And the gains, even a partial understanding of how networks operate, could take us very much further in delivering better social and economic outcomes.